So it's really a privilege for me to be in a setting with so many people who have so much expertise on Latin American media and have done so much also real empirical research. I mean, it's really quite an impressive conference from that point of view. I'm a little apologetic about the contribution I can make to it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I don't really have a developed analysis to present to you. I have an ambition to do some broad synthetic comparative work on Latin American media. So I'm starting to think about it, but I'm just at the beginning of that project, so I don't have a developed analysis to present to you. The other thing is that the presentation is going to be a little bit rough today because I made the decision that I was going to attend this conference, and so probably the most useful thing to do would be to comment on a lot of what I learned. So I didn't prepare very elaborately, particularly the second part of the presentation, which is maybe in some ways the most interesting. And so, okay, I apologize in advance if it gets a little bit rough and disorganized. What I'm basically going to do is two things. I'm first of all going to talk about my earlier work, the book Comparing Media Systems on Western Europe and North America, and how I think about the relation of that work to the study of Latin America. And secondly, I'm going to comment on various papers that I've heard here and things that I've learned here, but also particularly focusing on the proposal by Guerrero and Marcus Ramirez for the proposal of the captured liberal model as a way of conceptualizing Latin American media systems. This is really the first attempt of this sort, right, to develop a sort of broad theoretical framework for conceptualizing the specificity of Latin American media systems. And Mireia just gave me the book while I was at the ICA meeting, and I read it on the plane coming here. And I'm just beginning to formulate some thoughts about it, and I'll present those here. I guess Mireia is not here anymore, is that right? That's too bad. I had hoped maybe to get some dialogue going, but I guess I'm probably going to go to Mexico City soon, so I can present it again there, and she can hear it there. So anyway, starting out with comparing media systems. Okay, I'm assuming that everybody here knows the conceptual framework of that book. You know that we have these three models, the three ideal types of the liberal, polarized, pluralist, and democratic corporatist systems. We have these four dimensions of comparison: structure of media markets, political parallelism, professionalization of journalism, and role of the state. And I'm assuming that everybody basically knows about those. I'm going to get a little bit more into the substance as I go along. I want to start out, because this is particularly important once we begin to sort of move the analysis outside of the original area, to talk about some of the qualifications or clarifications maybe, particularly about the use of this concept of models, media system models, because a lot of the misunderstandings, I would say, of our framework come from things related to this. So first of all, it's important to stress that particular cases don't necessarily fit the ideal type. So our models are conceived as ideal types in the Weberian sense. And the use that we conceive for them is not to classify systems. So not to say that a particular case, that is a particular national media system or whatever level we may be looking at, belongs to this particular model, but to use the model as a point of comparison, to conceptualize that particular system, and to ask, well, in what ways does it fit this pattern, and in what ways does it not fit this pattern, and how do we account for the fact that it either does or doesn't, and it may in certain ways deviate from the pattern, and so on. A second important point is that models are not necessarily, the particular cases, that is, are not necessarily internally homogeneous. So a media system does not have a kind of single logic that applies to all different aspects of the media system. So we make the point, for example, that there in some sense are several different cultures of journalism in Britain. There's the BBC broadcast culture, there's the tabloid news culture, and there's the quality news print culture, and they're actually quite different cultures. And there's a particular history of how they developed when they did it in the sectors that they did. Of course, it's been a point of many of the papers here that that media systems often differ geographically, and in particular, it's a very common phenomenon in Latin America, that there's a difference between the national media system and regional media systems, and the power structures are often quite different between them. And this is an example of what we mean by when we stress that media systems are not necessarily homogeneous. Media systems are not necessarily static also. They change both over time, and I think there's some interesting questions as I go along about, because Latin America is characterized by a lot of change historically, and so there's some interesting questions about whether we conceptualize a system as having continuity over those changes or as changing from one system to another. But European media systems that we analyzed in the original book have a lot of change as well, right? So Spain went from being a dictatorship to a democracy, and systems have gone from having party press to having mainly commercial press, and so on. So there are changes historically, and there are also changes that are more conjunctural, right? That is to say, media systems operate differently depending on the particular situation that you're talking about, a particular historical conjuncture, a particular issue that you may be talking about. So one important theoretical point to stress here is that a system is not an entity that has fixed properties. A system involves patterns of variation. So, and this becomes particularly important when you're doing empirical studies, because you're not always going to find the same thing about how a media system operates, depending on a particular moment in time, a particular issue that you're studying. So, okay, so these are some general points about our conceptual framework. Now, let me talk about the applicability of our framework outside of its original scope. So, the framework that we put forward is based on an analysis of, 18 countries, I think it's 18, in Western Europe and North America. We very deliberately rejected the idea of developing a universal framework that could be applied to any media system at any time. And we conceived this as an analysis of these particular historical situated media systems. So it's not intended as a framework that can be applied to the rest of the world. We do think that it's useful for people studying media systems in other parts of the world in various ways. I mean, I think that the way that we most hope it will be useful to people studying media systems in other parts of the world is just as an example of how to do this kind of comparative analysis by, for example, trying to put together the theory dealing with the political system and the theory dealing with the media system, and ask about the connections between them by asking about the historical evolution of media systems and trying to understand why the patterns evolve different ways in different systems. So we hope that the approach will be useful. We also certainly hope that because people are always comparing other media systems to so-called Western systems, we hope to kind of demystify the idea of those Western systems by presenting them not as these ideal normative models, and then comparing real media systems with the normative models, but to conceptualize them as actual, concrete, historical media systems, and then make the comparisons on the basis of the more concrete analysis. And we also wanted to stress the plurality of Western media systems, right? To make the point that there is not a Western model of media systems, that there are actually a lot of different paths that the development of Western media systems follow. And we hope that that would make possible much more fruitful kinds of comparisons. People have, of course, used our framework to begin to, compare other media systems, and to some extent that's useful. Not, I think, when people try to apply our models to other systems, but if they ask about the relationship of other systems to those models, the similarities and differences that they may have, that works better with some kinds of systems than for others. So East Europeans, for example, very often locate their cases on our triangle here, right? Typically somewhere on this line that runs between the polarized pluralist and liberal model. Some people originally asked us that whether there's some theoretical reason why there weren't any cases along that line, and I think the answer is no, absolutely not. And in fact, if you had to project other media systems in the world onto the triangle, most of them would probably fall along there somewhere. It's just have particular historical patterns. So in the case of Eastern Europe, this works to a certain degree, although right away you have to start making a lot of qualifications to that, because there are a lot of ways in which East European cases can't really be conceived as like somewhere in between. They have a lot of distinct characteristics that make them different from any of these systems. Other cases, of course, it would make no sense at all to try and locate it on the triangle, China or whatever. In the case of Latin America, at the end of the book, Mancini and I do make observations about the applicability of our models to Latin America. And in particular, we make the point, kind of similar to this, that you can conceive Latin American media systems as having a combination of characteristics, some of which look like the liberal model and some of which look like the polarized pluralist model. And of course, that makes sense historically, right? Because if you look at historical influences, well, there's influence from the Iberian colonization. There's also later cultural influence from France and Latin America that's very important to the formation of Latin American journalism. So of course there are important similarities with Southern European countries. There are also deeper structural reasons that are also related to colonization that have to do with the prevalence of clientelism and patrimonialism and other kinds of social structures. And then obviously there's a lot of influence from the United States, again, both cultural and structural, and that is manifest in particular in the high degree of commercialization of Latin American media systems. Latin America and the United States are the only two places in the world where broadcasting in particular developed as mainly a commercial system. So you definitely have a combination of characteristics, some of which are similar to the polarized pluralist countries in our system: politicization, instrumentalization of the media, clientelism, an interventionist state across many dimensions, and others, particularly commercialism, that are similar to the liberal. There are also, however, lots of important differences that separate Latin American media systems from both our polarized pluralist model and the liberal model as you find it in the US and in US, Canada, British Isles, Australia, places like that. And I think that we're just beginning to conceptualize what those differences are. I should say here, before I go on, that the three models that we use are particularly difficult, I think, to apply to other parts of the world. The four dimensions of comparison are easier to apply to the rest of the world, particularly if you conceive them broadly. Katrine Boltmer up in Leeds has made the point that You can conceive of these four dimensions as having to do with the relation of media systems to other main social systems. So our structure of media markets has to do with the relation of media to the economy. Political parallelism has to do with the relation of media to the party system. The role of the state, obviously, with the relation of the media to the state, and professionalization with the internal structure of the media field. And in some sense, you can ask these questions about any media system anywhere in the world. The particular values that you give to these dimensions, or the particular conceptualizations, those are going to have to change when you begin to move out of the media systems that we looked at. I think one of the most fruitful efforts to try and think through some of these differences is work that Alfonso de Albuquerque has done. First of all, in a chapter in our book, Comparing Media Systems Beyond the Western World. And then he has another article in Media, Culture, and Society where he does that. There he points out, well, one thing that he points out is that only one of the countries that Mancini and I studied has a presidential political system, and Latin American countries all do, and that's an important distinction that needs to be, the importance of that needs to be thought through. He also focuses particularly on the party system, and he makes the point that Western European political systems have a very particular history of the political party system. The development of mass parties in Western Europe is very important to understanding the development of the media system. And it's a very peculiar thing by world standards, right? So Western European political history is characterized by parties that are very stable over a long period of time. They have deep roots in society. They're both rooted in major socioeconomic divisions within society, and they also have organizational roots historically that penetrate down into society and involve ordinary people. They have stable identities that are rooted in political ideology and religion and social class and so on. And he makes the point that that's not true in most of the world, including Latin America. So Latin American political parties are typically much shallower in their social rooting. They're much more ephemeral. They're much weaker organizationally. And often they're just simply less central to the way politics works. Politics is much more personalized. The parties may come and go, but politics kind of centers around these big, major individual figures. Okay, I think that's an important argument, and it does suggest something about the difference. And by the way, that's true about a lot of the rest of the world as well, right? That politics is more personalized. Political parties don't have these kinds of social roots. Albuquerque goes on to make the argument that the whole concept of political parallelism is basically a Western European concept, and we shouldn't try and use it outside the scope of Western Europe. I don't really agree with that. It seems to me that the concept is more broadly relevant. It probably should actually be broadened to focus not only on the relation of the media to the party system, but more broadly on the system of political competition and cleavage, whatever that may be. Albuquerque makes the point that he has his particular definitions of what you need to have parallelism is that you need to have parties that are stable, with clear, cleavages and identities that are clear enough for media to have a sort of permanent connection with them. I don't really see it that way. I mean, one thing I would point out is that a lot of the sorts of phenomena that he's talking about that don't fit do exist also in Western Europe, right? So particularly in Southern Europe, one face of political parallelism is, Antonio Gramsci and l'Unità and l'Humanité in France and so on. It's the party paper that's rooted in that mass party. And, l'Unità is still around after 80 years or whatever it is, and it still has a communist ideology in a certain sense, right? Okay, so it's that kind of stability. But another part of what we talk about in relation to political parallelism in Southern Europe is the phenomenon of the Italian or the Greek businessman who buys a newspaper in order to intervene in the political world, who may have shifting political alliances. Italian or Greek politics can be very fluid, and people make alliances across ideological boundaries and so on, and people have particular interests that may be served by particular political alliances. I see that as part of political parallelism as well. Even Rupert Murdoch, of course, sometimes changes his political position depending on his personal interest and the particular political conjuncture. So I think that much more fluid forms of political alliance are also part of political parallelism. So similarly, I would say that even though Mexico before the fall of the PRI was a one-party system and would fit Albuquerque's criteria for political parallelism to exist, nevertheless, the alliance of media with the PRI in general, but also their alliances with different factions of the PRI and with particular politicians within the PRI, that is part of what I mean by political parallelism. Or if we take the example of the newspapers in Oaxaca that pick sides in a particular dispute, even if that's an ephemeral alignment, I would think of that as part of what I mean by political parallelism. So I think of the use of this concept of political parallelism not in terms of trying to generalize the West European image of what it is, but in terms of conceptualizing what different forms can it take in different systems, depending on how it is that political competition takes place and interests and ideologies are represented in the political system, and so on. Let me see here. Okay, so these are some comments about the use of the framework of comparing media systems. Now, let me go on to talk about, give some of my reactions to the proposal for the idea of a captured liberal model as a basis for understanding Latin American media systems. You know, as I was saying, this is a very ambitious effort to put forward an alternative conceptualization of Latin American media systems. And I think it's really a valuable contribution, and that's why I want to focus on it here. I do have some doubts about how one ought to go forward with using it. Actually, Silvio, I would say, raised a lot of those already yesterday, to make the point, first of all, that I think that we have to really think through what do we mean exactly by liberalism, what do we mean exactly by capture, what are the different forms that this captured liberalism might take, what are the different forms of capture, what are the different forms of liberalism, in what patterns do they co-occur, and how are they combined with one another. I think that there's a long way to go in thinking those things through. The value of this concept has to do with conceptualizing this combination of commercialization and politicization that characterizes Latin American media systems, and I think it's really valuable for foregrounding that in a somewhat different way than we do in our analysis, say, of the polarized pluralist model, or thinking about Latin America as combining characteristics of both of those. But the formulation is also very, very general, and that's one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to think of it as sort of the beginning and not the end of comparative analysis of Latin American media systems. And in particular, just to start out, I would say that I suspect we're going to need more than one model to analyze, to do comparative analysis on Latin American media systems. I think just as it took us 3 models to analyze West European media systems, and some other people who've been trying to go forward with our analysis say, well, actually there are four models in Western Europe. That's one of the most interesting recent articles. I forget the author of it, who did the quantitative analysis of some of our indicators and say, actually, we've discovered that there are four. I think that we're going to need several models to conceptualize Latin American systems. In fact, this concept, I'm going to elaborate on this as I go along here, but depending on how you define it, this concept of captured liberal model may actually be very, very general. So I can certainly conceive of reconceptualizing the polarized pluralist model in Western Europe as captured liberal. It's all of the systems that we're talking about in Western Europe are liberal, right? I mean, they all have privately owned press and so on. So I guess we would have to say that in a certain way, those polarized pluralist countries are captured liberal. And in fact, it would probably also apply to a lot of other parts of the world that have this combination of politicization and commercialization, which is very common. So, but if we conceptualize it too broadly, then it doesn't really help us with the specificity of Latin America or with the different forms of media in Latin America. I have a lot of questions about how exactly we want to define capture and how far capture can take us. And some questions about whether the concept really applies to all Latin American media systems or applies or helps us more with some than others. One thing I wonder is, could we really conceptualize Venezuela, for example, as captured liberal, or has the role of the state become so large that it's not a liberal system anymore, and it doesn't make sense to conceptualize it in this way? Venezuela, by the way, is obviously part of a particular cluster that suggests a model that we might look at, which is these systems that have confrontations, media wars, right, between populist regimes, the commercial media, and particular patterns of state intervention that are intended to rebalance the relationship. That's obviously a distinct model that's worth pursuing. There are some questions about how lasting a model it will prove to be, or whether it's really a conjuncture. It's a particular phase. I mean, obviously, it's existed at other times in Latin America. It's existed, with Perón, maybe with Fujimori in a slightly different form on the right rather than the left. So maybe it's something that comes and goes. But it's obviously somewhat different, and at least in certain versions of it, like Venezuela, I'm not sure it's correct to conceptualize it as captured liberal. I was also thinking with we had a number of papers about Chile today. And with a number of those, I was thinking about how much the concept of capture actually helps us to analyze the power relations involved. So, Chile has a highly concentrated media system that is in the control of conservative elites. So in that sense, the concept of capture seems to apply pretty well to Chile. On the other hand, when I think about a lot of the phenomena of journalistic practice and performance that we've been talking about today, I'm not actually sure how far the concept of capture takes us in understanding those, right? So if the Chilean media represent the Mapuche in denigrating ways and marginalize their participation in politics, or if they are ideologically homogeneous, I'm not sure that that's really fully explained by media concentration. One of the reasons that I have to doubt that is because those phenomena are so similar to the pattern that you find in other liberal systems that are not so concentrated and that you would not normally describe as capture. So it seems to me we might want to understand those things in terms of ideological hegemony, in the more broad terms that it's developed in work on British media, say, or US media. We might want to conceptualize those phenomena in terms of market forces, and the fact that newspapers have upper middle class readerships and present the news for those upper middle class readerships. We might conceptualize some of those phenomena in terms of routines of journalism, as we would in US media studies, and the relations of journalists to other political elites. And I'm not sure that those phenomena, I think that if we were to broaden the concept of capture to cover those kinds of phenomena, then all liberal systems would be captured liberal. And in fact, maybe all media systems anywhere in the world would be captured whatever. And then the concept isn't really useful anymore. It's just too general to be useful. All media systems have structures of power that influence the performance of journalism. All media systems are affected by the stratification system, the distribution of power, and they reflect that in important ways. So if we attach the term capture to any system in which power affects the media system, then of course all media systems are captured. But I don't think that the term has the power if it becomes that general. One thing that I point to here is the distinction between instrumental and structural theories of power. In state theory in the 1970s, particularly as Marxist state theory kind of reemerged in Western countries, there was this big debate about structuralism and instrumentalism and the study of power. So there was one, and there was a kind of a critique of older instrumental conceptions that emphasized particular individuals or particular interests that were acting in a particular way to shape the political process. So, certain industries donate money to politicians and then they are able to influence the political process, or you have certain people have particular ties to certain political parties or something like that, so they influence those political parties. So it's a kind of direct, personalized kind of influence. And then you have structural forms of influence that are more impersonal, often more open, where you have a process of competition, but there are biases that result from the structure of the system that result in certain interests winning more consistently than others. And there was a kind of analysis of why those patterns existed in terms of structure rather than in terms of personal instrumental action. I think you can apply that same kind of distinction to analyzing power in media systems. One of the points that Mancini and I make in our book is that within the European media systems that we're talking about, the relative balance of those two forms of power is a bit different in the different systems. So in the liberal and democratic corporatist system, we think the structural forms of power are mostly predominant, although of course instrumental forms of power do exist, but that in Southern Europe, instrumental forms of power are more common. In particular, we have media that are owned by a particular individual who has particular interest, and you would understand the politics of the newspaper in terms of the instrumental action by that particular owner. It's an important distinction, I think, and I think that we should keep it open in Latin America. What's the balance of those different forms of political power? And it probably varies considerably from one country to another, and also from one sector of the media system to another, and from one conjuncture to another within Latin American media systems. There are certain phenomena that are common to Latin America that seem to me to be really well conceptualized by the notion of capture. That includes the instrumentalization of media that comes from dependence of media on government advertising or paid content, the kind of instrumentalization that comes from the engineering of control over broadcast licenses or the ownership of particular media by political actors that are trying to put people in power that will support their interests. It also is, I think, very good way of conceptualizing the role of Marinho or Azcárraga as media owners who use their media to intervene in the political world in certain very direct kinds of ways. Okay, all of those things, I think it makes a lot of sense to refer to them as capture. The operation of market forces and the way that influences the politics of news, that I don't think of as capture. That I think is a different kind of constraint on the media, a different way in which power is manifested. Similarly, the operation of journalistic routines, of ideological hegemony, of the journalists' dependence on government sources, or their relationships to particular other actors in society, that I don't think is necessarily capture. I think it's another way in which power is manifested in media systems. Also, I think there are other kinds of phenomena that, from a different point of view, I'm not sure I would describe as capture. Violence against journalists, for example, I don't think that I would characterize that as capture. It's an external restraint on the media. Capture to me means a kind of internal control of the media through ownership or something like that. The kind of external constraint that comes from something like violence against journalists or from, let's say, libel and desacato laws or other forms of state intimidation of media. This also doesn't seem to me to be capture. It could perhaps lead to capture if it were extensive over a long period of time and combined with certain other things. Although, I mean, another thing about this is that it's not liberal also. And to the extent that it's quite extensive in the media system, then I think it raises a question about whether that media system is correctly characterized as liberal. So this is another manifestation of power that I think I would exclude from the notion of capture. And I would suggest that these phenomena probably suggest the limits of capture, right? That these things it wouldn't be necessary to exercise power in these ways if media were actually captured by the major players. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Well, this one, okay, I'm coming to the end now, and I'm happy to begin general discussion. One other thing that I wanted to say, I meant to mention earlier, but I think I'll talk about it a little bit now, is culture. Okay, Mireia in her talk yesterday asked about this list here, well, where's culture? And that's a question that's been asked many times of us. One person who asked it, I think from the very, very beginning, one of the first to ask it was Jay Blundler, who I saw yesterday or 2 days ago in Leeds. He was saying, where's culture here? So the answer that Mancini and I give to that is culture is everywhere. We conceive of culture as a dimension of all of these variables that we're talking about. And also, these are the media system variables, also the political system variables. Each of these things can be understood as having both structural and cultural dimensions, which we see as inseparable, right? So we do not see culture as a separate variable. We see it as a part of social structure, and we conceive of social structures as having cultural components. So Silvio raised the question about, well, okay, is clientelism culture, or is it structure? It's a form of domination. So, you know, similarly, I would say clientelism, which I consider very central to understanding Latin American media systems as it is to Southern European media systems and media systems in a whole lot of the world. I conceive of that as partly something structural. It has to do with power relations. It has to do with the distribution of who controls resources and how they trade those resources, in particular patterns of social relationship. It also has very important cultural dimensions that expand out quite a bit from that. So for example, the fact that in systems that are characterized by clientelism, information is typically thought of as a private resource and not as something that circulates publicly. There's also very often a kind of skepticism of the idea of a public interest that transcends particular interest. There are a lot of cultural components and correlates of clientelism that are extremely important, but we don't see it as a separate variable from these that we talked about. Okay, the final thing that I want to say here, and then I'll wrap up, is that I noticed in Mireille's book and in her presentation, one thing I thought was kind of interesting is that sometimes the term liberal captured is hyphenated, and sometimes it's not. It got me thinking about an interesting question that I have about the relation between the concepts there. So to me, it seems like not hyphenating it means that the term liberal is the term captured is an adjective that modifies liberal, and it sort of implies that the whole media system is simultaneously liberal and captured. That each element of it is liberal and each element is also captured. If you hyphenate them, it sort of implies to me some form of hybridity, in which elements of liberalism and elements of capture are combined in the media system, and they might overlap in some places and not overlap in other places and be combined in various ways. So I think that it would make a lot of sense to address that kind of distinction in the way you think about what it means to conceptualize a captured liberal system. To my mind, it's better with the hyphen and conceiving it in terms of hybridity. Because it seems to me that Latin American media systems, like just about any media systems, are actually quite complex combinations of different elements. And certainly in the case of Latin America, some elements of the media system look a lot like capture. Some of them look more liberal in the different forms of liberal. Some of them look like both. And I think it's particularly important to conceptualize that sort of diversity. One thing that I worry about a bit with the concept of captured liberal is whether it skews the analysis too much in the direction of the assumption that media systems are closed and controlled. And whether there are too many phenomena that are actually rather important that would get marginalized by that, right? Whether it is the contestations that take place in which social movements or other actors may challenge political power and actually grab attention of media and affect public opinion in important ways, or the fact that journalistic professionalism may become entrenched in some certain areas, or journalists may move toward it. Various forms of agency and openness I'm talking about here that I think might start to be conceptualized as just marginal, when perhaps they shouldn't be conceptualized as just marginal. So partly for that reason, I'd like to keep in the hyphen and say, we're talking about hybridity here. We're not talking about the whole system being captured and the whole system being liberal. Or another example of that would be a kinds of media, the media law in Uruguay, which is a departure from liberalism in certain ways, sort of moving Latin American countries in the direction of the democratic corporatist system, let's say, and certainly may end up being a kind of challenge and exception to capture. Okay, so those are my comments, and I'm happy to hear your reaction.